Welcome to the Practical Enneagram. Tom Condon has been in the Enneagram world from the very early days and has taught the Enneagram around the world. He is perhaps most well known for trailblazing the integration of the discipline of Neuro-linguistic programming, or NLP, with the Enneagram, but you may know him for other reasons too. If you've been Googling Enneagram, then you definitely have found your way to thechangeworks.com, where there is a treasure trove of downloads and books. Tom's approach to the Enneagram is fiercely practical. He blends the traditional with the innovative. This was my first opportunity to meet Tom, although I have consumed a lot of his content online. It was everything I expected. Tom is a sharp, engaging, witty presence and a very clear and precise communicator. As a coach, you get the sense of someone who lives in the complexity for you and just brings forth the most relevant strategy for change. It's obvious that he knows and understands the mechanics of change very well. I learned a lot in this conversation, some of it a bit scary. Horribly, Tom brought my attention to my own hypermnesia. The stuff at the end, after I asked Tom about himself, is amazingly rich for coaches. I encourage you to visit Tom's website, thechangeworks.com. I also know he's just written a book, so you might want to look into that. Enjoy. Taking the time to do this with me.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
I'm sure it's absurd how many times you've told this story, but I would love to know how the Enneagram came your way and at what point it became sort of central to your work.
I lived in Berkeley, California in 1980, and it was in the air, mainly among therapist friends of mine. But I got, and I did take a class one time from Helen Palmer. But mostly I had friends who would, we used to say mimeograph.
Mimeograph?
Never mind. Copy notes that they took and notes that were handed out at classes. I had a background in NLP, Neuro-linguistic programming, which I should say right off is a very mixed bag. It's got some really great distinctions that are very useful in working with the Enneagram. But at the same time, it's a little on the sleazy side. Sort of has this kind of promotes this aura of you can make magical changes in 2 minutes and you won't recognize yourself in the mirror after that. But nevertheless, the good part of NLP really dovetails and marries nicely with the Enneagram in my experience. And so NLP is based on, it's essentially behaviorism and with a little bit of cognitive behavioral therapy mixed into it. And it is about patterns and working with patterns and trying to avoid content, trying to emphasize process rather than content. The two uses of it, in my experience, are one, the process is grounded in the senses. So if somebody says something like, I want to get in touch with my essence, what an NLP practitioner would want to know is, what do you feel? What do you see? What do you hear? What do you taste? What do you smell? What do you feel emotionally? What do you feel physically in your body? And then even get more local about that. Where do you feel it? And that sort of thing. That's in lieu of sitting back and thinking, oh yeah, essence, I know what that is. It's just a word.
Yeah.
And the other thing that they did with NLP, which I think really worked, is they went and analyzed the behavior of really good psychotherapists and good communicators and tried to figure out what they all had in common, even though they described what they did in very different terms and had very different models and theologies for what they did. The NLP guys extracted the content, or the process rather, and that's extremely useful in working with the Enneagram and also evaluating what to do with different Enneagram styles. So by the time I found the Enneagram, I'd hit NLP's limitations, which were that it's not a good system for understanding the whole person. And you have these techniques and you have these methods, but you really didn't necessarily comprehend the depth of them.
Right.
For example, NLP has a number of very good ways of working with phobias that are quite effective, actually. But a phobia, a kind of instantaneous reaction of fear, is a much different thing in a 6 than in an 8. In an 8, it's got something to do with their vulnerability. In a 6, it's got something to do with their identity and their defensive way of protecting themselves by anticipating the worst. So one of the things that really hit me about the Enneagram was the depth of it. In those days, the depth was mainly negative. It was all about your fallen state, how screwed up you were, how neurotic you were. And, I was getting handwritten notes from therapists who had gone to these classes, and that's partially what was being taught. And in those days, these solutions were not very plentiful, dealing with your fallen state. That is to say, you could meditate and you could try to oppose it. In other words, judgmental and you're a 1, knock it off. Quit being judgmental. Every time you're judgmental, do something else.
Not very effective.
No, but there is a limited benefit in doing something like that, where you're sort of onto yourself and you start recognizing your pattern and you start trying to grapple with it. But at the same time, if you just do something like that, you just oppose the defensive tendencies within your Enneagram style. It's sort of like isometrics. You kind of pull one muscle against another and strengthen both muscles.
Yeah.
So it's got limited appeal, and you might get somewhere over a long period of time, but it just didn't seem sufficient to me. Plus, I knew about all these methods, and I thought, well, the Enneagram needs anything you can throw at it. So it did.
Yeah. It's gone a long way now, hasn't it? So the Enneagram field has other ways of working with these type patterns that aren't just all about counteracting them.
Yeah, definitely. They fall into different classes. I would say, and some of them are more useful than others, or depends on the person and their situation. And even though we talk about types all the time in Enneagram literature and culture, people are individuals, it turns out. So within that understanding, then you have to approach working with their general character structure. And at the same time, work on something that is vexing or troubling to them, or a way in which they're getting in their own way. Also, I responded to the difficult excesses of Enneagram styles where people are really caught in their trance. They're caught in their pattern as a form of defendedness. And I found that the most useful way to go at it. When somebody was reacting or overreacting from within their Enneagram style in a way where they didn't have choice. One of the things that was worth probing for was how there was a kind of unconscious defense against, ancestors or early things that the person had bottled up, or ways in which they had adapted and overemphasized one part of their experience and underemphasized another. I'm a 1, so I'm good. I'm a 4, I'm special. I'm a 6, so I'm loyal, or whatever. But where they're overdoing it, which is usually what most people want to work on. They debate a lot about whether it's genetic or not. We won't know until there's a blood test. But at the same time, somebody said to me one time, it was a 9, said, well, I may have been born a 9, but I definitely learned how to be unhealthy.
That was your wife, right, Tom? I heard that.
Yeah, it was my wife.
That's brilliant. Is she in the Enneagram world?
Just parenthetically.
Yeah, I was just curious.
And using it at the office and that kind of thing.
So you were really the person that combined NLP with the Enneagram?
Well, I started it, I guess.
Yeah.
At the time, there was only Helen Palmer's school and Don Rizzo's school, and a little bit of Claudio Naranjo, although he was mostly overseas teaching. And they were quarreling with one another.
Yeah.
And I thought it was a good thing to just avoid that altogether. And also to just kind of stick to a point of view and deepen it, rather than trying to subscribe to one version of reality about the Enneagram or another. It just seemed silly. And also, I'd seen this in NLP, where people would get together and talk about forming an organization that united everybody, an umbrella organization. But at the same time, it just made the quarreling worse because it was a bunch of business competitors.
I had heard that you managed to stay out of it. I think maybe from Jerry. You and Jerry Wagner are friends, right?
Yeah, we are. And he managed to stay out of it too.
It's interesting. You know, the sleaze associated with NLP is probably why I haven't been able to get deep into it, Tom, because I've been put off, and then because of my type as well, because I'm a 4, there's that as well. It's a problem. But can you say what is good NLP and what are the fundamentals of an NLP informed approach to coaching?
Well, the patterns they identified in NLP show up in lots of people's methods, like I was kind of implying. And I see it a lot in Enneagram circles. One kind of general approach is to bring together strengths with quote unquote weaknesses, or apply the high side of your Enneagram style to the low side of your Enneagram style, bring them together, see what happens. You are in effect going against the pattern, but also you're trying to introduce elements that the person has inside of them that are underused when they're in the trance of their style. Another approach is implicit in what most people do initially with the Enneagram, and sometimes at greater length, which is to learn how to stand back from your pattern, learn about it as a pattern, stop taking it so personally, stop taking other people's behavior so personally, because you sort of see through their defenses and kind of sense what they think they're doing. Also, some of these other models that are attached to the Enneagram, some of them are fatuous, but some of them are really useful. And it's more like conscious cognitive understanding, along with meditative practices that allow you to stand back from your pattern and witness it rather than react to it. For example, with 4s, that can be a really useful thing to see your feelings rather than to feel them quite so much anyway. You're not going to wipe that out anyhow, but to stand back and to witness, and in the witnessing, have a kind of non-attachment. And in the witnessing, sort of learning, it's sort of like you're watching a dream or something like that. That kind of enterprise and that kind of effort is valuable.
Yeah.
If you only do that, you can easily find change very slow, because you have a lot of information, you have a lot of cognitive understanding, but people will fall into traps with the Enneagram rather easily and, warp it so that it becomes a new version of the same old thing. There's another one where you sink into a feeling, you embrace a feeling, you go to the depth of it, you go to the depth of a reaction. It's not necessarily a feeling, but usually that's included. And in sinking into the depth of it, part of what you're after is, well, what am I trying to do for myself? How am I trying to help myself with this reaction? What does it do for me? What are the advantages of it? Or what were the advantages of it? The perceived necessity that I had when I was younger to protect myself in a certain way and to, make a shadow within myself of certain capacities so that I could fit into a family role, or process trauma by not processing it, kind of locking it away, managing it in a way. Also protecting yourself from the unknown, that's something people do with it. That'll come up sometimes in meditation, where there's, you're in kind of direct contact with the void. That's an experience that people seek, but they also fear.
Well, I did not know that these sort of tools and principles were NLP. Are you generally, when you're working with people now and in the past, you're doing some sort of typing exploration with them at the beginning of your work together?
At this point, a lot of people know their Enneagram style. And if they don't, they'll be divided between 2 Enneagram styles. At which point you ask, well, which one would you rather not be? But also, I found it helpful sometimes if somebody couldn't decide between 2 styles, to just arbitrarily pick one and work on them as though they are that style. And one of 2 things happens. Either you're putting pressure on something that's not really there, and the true style pops. A few weeks later or a few months later, they suddenly realize, oh no, that was wrong. I know what I know what style I have. Or if you're lucky and you pick the right one, then you do effective work. Kind of takes your reputation as a typer kind of takes a hit.
Yeah, totally worth it and quite effective. I spent years believing that I was a 7 and attempting to observe the 7 patterns. And honestly, it was like flogging a dead horse after a while. I wasn't getting any juice from the Enneagram.
Yeah. Goes with the 3 wing also, usually, if you're a 4 and you think you're a 7.
Yeah, really. Is that right?
People have in the last few years been throwing out wings, but I always found it pretty useful.
So you've spoken to this a little bit already, but NLP and Enneagram is a marriage of process and content. Could you say that?
I would say.
Yeah. So how does the Enneagram empower NLP?
Well, it gives it depth. It gives it a deep context.
Yeah.
Now, somebody who was, in the old days anyway, somebody who was pure NLP would say, oh, well, that's just content. Kind of dismiss it, go back to focusing on the pattern. But, the Enneagram is describing patterns, and people get caught in them in predictable ways sometimes, although at the same time, everybody's unique. And I just find the combination of it sort of obvious. I always did. Like I talked about 4s learning how to stand back to a degree. And there are other styles that need to learn, like 5s, for instance, maybe need to learn how to step more fully into their experience and to feel their feelings and walk a mile in their own shoes, that kind of thing. And it's the same, in a broad way, there are different approaches for different styles. And then there are particular and specific approaches that relate to the person in front of you.
Yeah. I always thought NLP was, my understanding of it was that it was a lot on language, Tom, and like the language we use. And then I was Googling and I found this concept called a meta program. Curious to know, does each Enneagram type have meta programs that they tend to favor, or? People
do. And then sometimes it breaks down in terms of styles. One meta program has to do with motivation, especially motivation to change. And it's broken into 2 parts. One is going towards and one is going away from. And what that means is if somebody is going towards, they have a goal, they have a focus, they have something that they are willing to make even a leap into the unknown in order to achieve or to have for themselves or to feel different and respond differently. And then going away from means you're trying to avoid something. You're trying to avoid a pain or a shadow or a type of conflict or whatever it is. And that's kind of useful on several levels in my experience. You might say, for example, 7s are concentrated mostly on going towards. I remember one time introducing this concept in a workshop, and there was a panel of 7s, and I said, so, how many of you, go towards what you want? And all their hands shot up. And then you might contrast that with 6s who are going away from, in the sense that, the 6 says, well, I have to get over my anxiety, otherwise my wife will leave me. This kind of avoiding a worse alternative. Which is, kind of goes with the character structure. The thing about it is there's another level, which is that usually people have both of those motivations, and one is less conscious than the other. So, for example, 7s who are talking about going towards their new excitement or their new interest or their new possibility may also be running away from something simultaneously and not quite realize it. I'm trying to get away from the sense of burden or get away from the sense of being judged or being eternally bored in my job or whatever it is, and go towards my next exciting trip to Morocco. Or, it could be more personalized than that. I want to get in touch with my essence. I want to manifest the high side of my Enneagram style. But the low side of your Enneagram style is chasing. It's like, we had a baseball player named Satchel Paige who used to say, don't look back. Something might be gaining on you. And you could flip it over to sixes also, who are trying to avoid a worse alternative. But there are a lot of sixes who have things in their life that they are willing to risk because of deeper values and things that are important to them, or that are interesting to them, or that are, just sort of part of a path of learning. And so it usually goes with the social subtype, or as an expression of the social subtype, although all sixes have a social subtype somewhere. And it has to do with a sense of mission, a sense of this only I can do, or this is worth doing, even though it seems scary. So you have both motivations in combination, and it's good to know. It's good to recognize which one you're responding to, and also it points you towards things you might want to clean up.
Can you say what a metaprogram is, Tom? Sorry, I should have asked you that before you began that.
Well, they're up to about 60 of them now.
Wow.
And I only about 19 make any sense to me. They're just kind of distinctions about patterns that people get caught in.
Right.
Another one that I rather like that applies nicely to the Enneagram is what we call sorting styles. It's how a person thinks, how a person filters, it includes their feelings and their total experience. But it sort of forms into a stack, what Don and Russ used to call a stack in relation to the subtypes. The possibilities is somebody sorting for people? Is somebody sorting for place? Is somebody sorting for information, activity, those kinds of things, and things also. So you might find with somebody who's very focused on self-preservation that they're very thing-oriented. You might find that twos on the surface are very people-oriented, but when they're in their trance and they're more unknown to themselves, their approach to other people as things. People are objects. People are objects to be maneuvered around. Find that with threes sometimes too. They're moving through life and people are, supportive of their goals or unsupportive, and it's like you're on a chessboard or something. It's different. Fours can be very place-oriented, atmosphere. Walk into a new place and have a multi-sensory reaction to the decor of the place. Or have a sense of place within yourself. Nines have it too sometimes. Somebody else could be very information oriented. Threes, fives, some sevens. Those things are useful to me to identify and to help somebody break out of them or expand their range.
So are you discerning their meta programs from just being in conversation with them during the sessions? You're discerning, say, that meta program around sorting, what they're sorting for?
Yeah, I do this for a living.
Yeah. So you do it very quickly, probably.
Well, it's implicit. It's in the mix. It's in the stew.
So I'm just trying to understand how the process for change works.
In the old days, NLP was taught alongside Ericksonian hypnosis. That was one source of interest and focus in language, because people use hypnotic language a lot and hypnotize themselves a lot and don't quite realize it. And it's not just a metaphor. You could describe somebody who's caught in their Enneagram pattern as being in a personality trance. There are elements to the trance that are characteristic of people when they're in official hypnotic trances.
Really? My God.
Well, for example, one is amnesia. Sometimes people will be in a trance and with a skilled hypnotherapist where they're working on something. The hypnotherapist, him or herself, might want the client to not remember very much, sort of like forgetting a dream, so that their unconscious kind of works on what happened. But also people will wake up from trances sometimes and they don't remember. And that's called amnesia. Well, we talk about amnesia in relation to nines, amnesia for the self, amnesia for sixes, amnesia for successes. We talk about sevens having amnesia for commitments. The opposite of amnesia is called hypermnesia, and it's characteristic it comes up much more with fours and sometimes 6s, and some other styles too, 2s sometimes. What it means is you remember the past experience in unusually vivid detail that puts you right back in the experience, so that you are that age and you are in that place and you are in that time. And you have extraordinary sensory detail. 4s will do that, when they are nostalgic, for example. 6s will do that when they're scaring themselves. They'll say, well, I'd love to go have Mexican food, but I did it this one time and I got so sick. The waiter was rude, and the food was I didn't really like the food, but then afterwards, for a couple of days, I was sicker than a dog. And so I don't want to go to a Mexican restaurant today. Yeah, I remember it like it was yesterday. It was 1972 in Tucson, Arizona. And the person goes into this memory trance. The fact that I was afraid back then becomes the justification for not risking something today, or sending that into the future. You're sort of time traveling within, a lot of times with the mental 5, 6s, and 7s. There's a little more time traveling. And you project it into the future. If I went to that Mexican restaurant now, I'll probably get sick again, and who knows if waiters are any nicer than they used to be, that kind of thing. So there's amnesia, there's hypermnesia, there's what they call age regression, which is kind of goes with hypermnesia, where you go back into the past and you not only remember the past in a really vivid way that you're back inside of, but you are that age. There was a study a few years ago where they did MRIs on people who said that they had been traumatized when they were children, and they certainly were. But what the MRI revealed was that when a person remembers a past trauma, they're actually remembering the last time they remembered it. Really? Rather than, going all the way back, they go back to 2 weeks ago when they remembered it, in a conversation with a friend or something.
Gosh. Yeah.
Age regression means that you become younger than your years. You can see it in 2s. You can see it in 7s when they're, like Peter Pan. You can see it in 6s when they make themselves weak, and they're dependent on someone else. And some of the other styles, it kind of comes and goes. The opposite of age regression is age progression. And that means you're older than your years. Like there was a woman who was a 1. She said, even when I was riding around with boys as a teenager, I just felt like I was older than that. And when I turned 40, it was like my clothes suddenly fit. And I realized that had been my true age all along.
My goodness.
And you find age progression with 8s who are, kind of being strong, say within a family system. They're kind of stepping into a power vacuum, with 1s who step into a kind of competence vacuum, and they will become little premature adults. And it goes sometimes with some of the other styles. It kind of vacillates back and forth. 3s can be age progressed. They grow up thinking about what they're going to do when they really are grown up, and they can get out of the house and fulfill their goals. That kind of thing.
When you can hear expressions of these, I don't know, what do you call them? They're like little mini delusions. That's a strong word.
Hypnotic phenomena.
Yeah, that's better. Hypnotic phenomena. Do you tell the client or the person that you're working with about the principle of it so they can watch for it in their own experience?
Depends on the person. Depends on the relevance to what we're working on.
Right.
One thing, if you work with hypnosis, you learn not to jam everything into consciousness. And it depends on what the person is aware of themselves, sort of like using humor, which I tend to do.
Yeah.
A person has to understand that they are not the target of the humor, but that maybe their pattern is. There's no targeting in the sense that we're all in the same boat. We're all just kind of fools with good points.
I feel like this is something else you're associated with in the Enneagram field. The humor element. And it's important when we're working with models like the Enneagram, isn't it? Because it can get quite heavy.
People can get very serious about it, and they can get very dogmatic about it. Suddenly there's rules that you'd never heard before, and there's a specific method that you have to follow in order to get in touch with your essence. And if you don't do that, then you're screwed. It's not flexible enough. And also taking it too seriously as a kind of sacred something that fell from the sky. I never did approach it that way.
No.
Part of it's a psychological approach, but also part of it is that some people have turned the Enneagram into a religion unto itself, I think. And that's kind of suspect. It's kind of like, it's your ego's job to defeat the Enneagram. And to normalize it in some way and to turn it into something that's less biting and less threatening and less upsetting. And when people begin to over-identify with their Enneagram style or over-identify with a theological context in which they think about it, they sometimes are turning it into a new version of the same old thing. Or sometimes it's an expression of their Enneagram style.
Yeah. It does seem to be unavoidable.
Well, beginner's mind is a good thing to cultivate. I've done it for 40 years or so, and there were various stages where at a certain point I thought, well, now I've really got my hands around something. I really understand this damn thing. And then someone would come along and manifest an Enneagram style in a way I wasn't used to, and it would drop me to a new level. That seems right. You don't really wake up one morning and decide you understand everything there is to understand about human beings.
No. And the other thing I noticed with you teachers is some of you are still working with people and others are just teaching, or not just teaching, but no longer in one-on-one working relationships with people. So do you think that helps with the humility aspect?
Yeah, I suppose. It's not so much about humility for me as it is about getting back to basics sometimes, staying grounded in a certain way.
Yeah.
And the pandemic has actually helped with this. No more public workshops.
Yeah, that's true.
And it took a while to pivot. I took some time off anyway, but I've been working with clients all along. And it just keeps your toe in the water.
You must miss that. You like to get around and travel and stuff, don't you? Is that accurate still?
Well, I did it for 40 years. I've been to 50 countries.
Wow.
It makes my back hurt to say that. And it's it's kind of a mixture.
Yeah. Of 40 years, I mean, that's a long time to be on the go. It's tiring, isn't it, traveling?
Well, it's, no one will listen to you if you complain about being paid to go to Europe.
Yeah.
But it can be brutal sometimes. I used to go around the world and declared it my new commute, going from Japan to Hong Kong to Israel to Europe to Canada and then back to the States. That's the kind of travel that's not going to be possible for a while, I think. All the uncertainties and the different reactions in different governments.
That's an pretty insane way to travel, though. I mean, my self-preservation instinct is throwing its hands up. I couldn't be on that sort of schedule, I don't think. You would do all that quickly? Like you would move around like that?
Sometimes, yeah, it'd be like, 6 countries in 7 weeks or something like that. Pardon me. But the thing about it is that as you age, it's actually sort of disruptive in a good way. It's off balancing. It's, you're not only experiencing new stuff, but you're also kind of jostled out of any kind of complacency you might otherwise default to.
That's so true. Yeah. We've spoken about meta programs. Yeah, this is just a little question you can probably answer quite quickly, Tom, but do you always use the Enneagram when you work with people, or when might you not use it?
Well, at this point, most of the people who come to me are Enneagram familiar. So it winds up being there somehow or another. If somebody doesn't know about the Enneagram, or they just kind of heard of it, or there's an awful lot of people who said, yeah, I came across it 10 years ago. It seemed like stereotypes. There's a lot of people who say that also say, and then last year I encountered it again and it blew my mind. Yeah. But it's not necessary, again, following the idea that not everything needs to be jammed into consciousness. I will try to intrigue people sometimes if they don't know about it. And sometimes I'll just use it and not really call it by its name. But it helps me get right to the center of something really fast.
Yeah, that's the power of it, I guess. But given more people do know about it, I guess that must carry with it its own challenges. So preform over-identifications with their type. Does that happen a lot in the people that you're working with? They've taken their own type to heart too much or over-identified with it?
Well, yeah, they do. Not everyone, of course, but there's a certain reliable percentage. I just understand it and interpret it as maybe they're not self-studied. Maybe this hasn't been their walk in life to really think about these things. Maybe they're avoiding something. Like there are people who go for years learning about the Enneagram, being in an Enneagram community, but they can't make up their mind what their Enneagram style is, or they're nines and they identify with every style, but they're kind of obscuring something from themselves, or they've over-identified with their style and they're in a club of some sort. It's like we all know what our Enneagram number is, so somehow we're together and we're not going to die. I don't know what the motive is exactly, but it's different for different people. But the tendency to distort the Enneagram is pretty strong because your ego's job is to maintain a homeostasis and to keep things on, to maintain a certain storyline, a certain picture of the self that's within that, a self-image. There's a picture of the world that goes with it. I was talking about this at the IEA conference, talking about it in terms of metaphors. It's a kind of a metaphorical way of seeing the world, and people get attached to it. And, you have to accept that it's not everyone's walk in life to suddenly blindingly realize their own depths and begin to live out of those. There are plenty of people who don't care, and they live and die that way. Yeah. Part of God's great plan.
Maybe. What is your perspective on working with the instincts, Tom? Is it your view that the subtypes themselves lends to specific developmental work?
I work with them according to taste. It's al dente.
What do you mean?
I have my own perspective on the subtypes that started way back when. And to me, they're, among other things, and they've been reframed as expressions of the passions.
Yes,
definitely. In Enneagram terms. I was always looking for tangible manifestations of the preoccupations. If somebody was really very self-pres or very intimate or very social, and how those played out differently within different Enneagram styles, and how they motivated behavior, especially the downside, defensive behavior of Enneagram styles, and what the person might be over-identifying with, what they might be under-identifying with. They come into the mix, and, there may be a sense of injury in one of those areas of someone's experience, but people have all three. And they have them, they're maybe conscious of one. It's a little like wings. Somebody says, well, I have a 5 wing, but actually you also have another wing. It's almost like a trick of language. They were never presented to me anyway as a forced choice. And the same is with the subtypes. You've got them all. Boy, there's so much nuance to it that when I talk about it, people's eyes glaze over. But you could go through different phases in your life where different subtypes are emphasized. Like when you're in your 20s, you might be focused on finding a mate. When you're much older, you might be focused on self-preservation in a way you never were. Somehow you're raising children and you're in some sort of context, and you're in your middle 40s and you've got a job in a large company, you might be more social. Yeah. And there are external influences that way. And then people can cycle through the subtypes in a day. Yeah. I mean, but you have one that you lead with, maybe one or two that predominate, but the other ones come out. So I don't actually see the value in nailing them down too tightly. I have a lot of respect for accuracy, but you can overtype with the subtypes just like you can overtype with central Enneagram styles. Over-identify, becomes your explanation about why you are the way you are.
Yeah, that definitely happens, doesn't it? I get that the subtype is responsive to life, but isn't that a sign of sort of health and development of itself and freedom? If you're meeting life with the appropriate and relevant instinct, that seems no?
Somebody could be a self-preservation 3.
Yeah.
And they could be very focused on work. They could have an amazing work ethic. They could be trying to accumulate money and say property and things in order to be secure, because there's a connection to 6 from 3, and in the back of their mind they're worried about society breaking down or pandemics. And that person could be very successful at amassing money, or they could also be a self-preservation 3 and have a string of bankruptcies.
Really? That's news to me. I would have thought every self-preservation 3 would be successful.
No, not that's the trick word. Every.
Yeah, not all of them. Right. Okay. Yeah. Not all self-pres 3s would be, what's the word, resourceful or successful in the self-pres domains.
Yeah, it depends on the person and how they've organized their experience. And also how what's happened to them that they defended against. When things happen to us over and over again early in life, we start to do them to ourselves before anyone can. So a 9 grows up feeling deleted and overlooked and like the middle child, even though they're not the middle child. And what do? As adults, they go to a coach saying, I delete myself. I drop myself out of my own picture. And it becomes its own kind of defense. There's a rationale for it. And there's also a kind of a history with it. But at the same time, it's a obsolete response. It's a hangover.
Okay, I would like to ask you about your sexual 6. Is that right, Tom? Just want to get that checked out.
I guess. I don't use sexual, but
you don't use that word.
Yeah,
do you use counterphobic?
Counterphobic, and also, it's just terminology, but sexual is confusing to a lot of people. Intimate subtype, that's about what I call it.
What's it been like? So how would you say being intimate 6 has supported you in your work, and how has it got in the way?
It supported me mostly in terms of being able to zero in on whoever I'm working with. It's like we could be out around the rings of Saturn. I find this in friendships also, where the connections are so specific and singular and deep, and you can't mistake your friend for anyone else. When I was younger, young and stupid, one manifestation was of taking physical risks. They were calculated risks. I actually knew I could pull them off. But I used to climb hotels or jump off of bridges onto moving trains.
What?
Things like that.
Oh my
Ride
God.
Ride a motorcycle and go pump gas into the motorcycle with a lit cigarette in my mouth.
Oh my God. So the stories about counterphobic 6 are true. Just like
they were with me.
Really risky stuff. So
calculated risk, though.
Calculated.
Some of it, some of it was, I knew I could do it, but it was, and the purpose of it was to expunge fear, spell fear. You could feel your own, fearful response to whatever, and then go climb a building. And there was this kind of sense of triumph and of beating the fear that would, if you did it on a Sunday, that feeling would last until Tuesday.
That's not very long.
No, it's not. By Tuesday, you're back to scaring yourself over things that never happen.
So what do you do now to manage that structure that must still, these structures that persist, the fear structure for you as a 6?
Well, I don't climb buildings
that's good.
do physically overtly risky things. How do I manage it? There's various ways to go about it. In working with 6s, I'll sometimes use exaggeration. Like if a 6 scares themselves about something, I'd say, well, it's much worse than you think. And then have them go further and further and further with it until it turns into something ridiculous.
Right.
Or something that is the opposite of the original fear. Somebody's afraid of asking their boss for a raise, and then they're fired, then they die, then they're out in space, then they're atomized, and then they're, devoured by some giant cosmic beast. And how do you feel now? And the person says, peaceful. You just take it to the limit. That's one way. Another way is to micro analyze what it is you're afraid of. Or if you're scaring yourself about something, like when they talk about people having a fear of flying, the people will use that phrase to mean a lot of different things. Some people are afraid of takeoff and landing. Some people are afraid of turbulence. Some people are afraid of being locked in a metal tube, screaming through the sky with a bunch of strangers, which there's even more reason now than.
That's true.
But all of those go under the umbrella term of fear of flying.
Right.
And so starting to zero in on, well, what is it specifically? What's bothering me? What is it that, I'm worry boning? At a certain point, it's sort of like, oh, well, I can handle that. There's that sort of thing. Then there's, if you know NLP, there's another set of distinctions in NLP, just to make things more complicated. That is about what they call submodalities, which are the senses within the senses. And when somebody goes into their Enneagram trance, there are typical sensory qualities to it. They're not rigid, they're not absolute, but there's a general tendency. With sixes, some of the time when a six is scaring themselves, they'll see images in their mind's eye that are very large, that are larger than the six, which is a reflection of projected power. I see my boss, and my boss is this giant of a man. And then there's little me, sort of following the boss. But it's actually my power in disguise. There's some value in just experimenting with like shrinking the image or bringing it down from up above, bring it down so that it's at your waist, like you're looking at it on a table. Same with the audio part of it. There might be a loud soundtrack that goes with the vision of your scary boss or your admirable boss, however either way, romanticizing. And what happens if you turn down the volume? What happens if you concentrate on sixes who feel anxiety in their chest and they feel like a steel band in their belly sometimes? What happens if you work with those, and kind of liven them up or calm them down? Have imagery come out of them that the person can see and work with, something like that.
Those are great, such great techniques. I guess it would be beneficial as well to have someone, rather than attempt to do some of these yourself, especially the one where you're magnifying the fear or what was it? Or trying to get specific about the nature of the fear. I can imagine a six or anyone actually just getting lost in their own thought process about that. It's helpful to have a coach, I guess, or someone.
Well, it's the theater of the mind. Fall for your own creations.
Yeah.
Then, you get lost in them. I mean, the thing I like about grounding the Enneagram in direct experience, someone's experience of their Enneagram style directly, is that it also starts to imply, especially when you work with these things I was just describing, like shrinking images, you also start to imply that the person is the one doing it. That cuts against some Enneagram theology and literature that implies that the thing sort of fell from the sky.
Yeah.
You're kind of stuck with it. And beginning to recognize that they are the creator of their own difficulty, and that they are generating this. It's not happening to them. That's good with sixes, for example, who might tend to believe they are victims. Fours will do it sometimes. Twos will do it sometimes. I'm a victim of my own intensity. I'm a victim of my own melancholy. I'm a victim of my own fears. But actually, you're on another level, you're producing them for what was once a good reason or a series of reasons, a good adaptation to your early understanding of life.
Managing sixness, there's a variety of strategies you gave us there, mostly around the central pattern of doubt and fear.
But if you work with a one, for example, zeroing in on the critical voice is usually pretty helpful. Getting the person not only to hear it, but to recognize its location, move it around, move it into their shoe. Also, listen to what it's doing and also to see it. Sometimes people won't see the voice, they'll just hear it. But if they see it, they start to think, oh, wow, that's my Uncle Roger, or something. Or the images can be abstract. With twos, the twos will displace themselves emotionally into other people. It's like sending your inner child to live with the neighbors, sort of. And in doing that, you vacate your own body, helping a two reel themselves back in and kind of step inside their own direct experience. It's a good idea. With nines, sometimes I'll get nines upset just by describing what it's like to be a nine. They talk about anger in Enneagram books, but what's even more salient is that beneath the anger, sort of like a layer of sediment, there's sadness, grief, and there's a self who's hiding. They'll say, well, I'm a 9, so I'm a victim of my mental fog. Or a 9, you ask a 9 to focus on the problem, they'll just say, I just see a blank, or I just see a wall.
Interesting.
If you fall for that, you're stuck as a coach. But if you recognize that it's an internal image, and that it's a symbolic internal image, it symbolizes their self-deletion in a way, and recognize that rather than being victims of a fog, they're actually hiding. That's different. It's also different to say a 6 scares themselves than it is to say they're a fear type. Some volition and agency into it.
Yeah. Oh, so we've done 1, 2, 6, 9. I suppose maybe we might try to do the others, Tom, just so that no one feels left out. Are there imagery we can do for 3, 4, 5, 7, 8?
With 3, what I'm trying to do is get there's an insecurity usually in 3 when they're caught in their pattern, and whoever they're trying to become is the opposite of who they fear they are. And so getting those 2 things closer together is often really helpful. The attempt at role playing and achievement and image and getting recognized has to do with and is a compensation for the insecurity, a kind of Achilles heel. With 4s, there's myriad ways, there's a variety of ways to go about it. I talked about seeing feelings and getting a little bit of distance on that. Also, what's important is having modes of expression, taking what roils around inside of you, the kind of intensity, the kind of synesthesia that you have between the different senses, taking those and giving them form. Giving them expression. It doesn't have to be artistic necessarily, but it has to do with, if you're trying to help 3s get more inside themselves, in touch with their direct feelings. With 4s, the focus is somewhat that, but more generally and beneficially going towards the world rather than away from it.
Yeah.
With 5s, you can kind of zero in on how they scare themselves. Sometimes there'll be anxiety in the upper chest, and there'll be a way in which the person is going through life kind of negatively anticipating opposition. Not all 5s do this, but a lot of them do. A client of mine pulled into a gas station over here, a petrol station, and he saw an attendant coming. This is in the state of Oregon. And we still have petrol station attendants, not in the rest of the country. But he saw this guy coming towards him. The guy had a nose ring, and he had kind of long black hair on one side, and he was dressed in a goth sort of way, and had a couple of visible tattoos. And my 5 client started to clutch, stress out. And then the guy walks up, and with the sweetest smile, he says, "Can I help you?" Beginning to zero in on how 5s scare themselves, and then they'll scare themselves into hoarding. They'll scare themselves into a kind of stinginess about the self and not wanting to share, and working with getting them to assert themselves or to become proactive, sort of take the bull by the horns and decide and choose to go into a social situation, for example, rather than hold back and be, vacillate or be paralyzed or whatever. But, with 5, 6, and 7, you're basically dealing with power and projected power as a tendency. With 8, 9, and 1, it's more like the people delete themselves within those styles. With 2, 3, and 4, it's more like people are embarrassed or ashamed of something, and they're pushing it away. 2s push away selfishness, 3s push away failure, 4s push away being ordinary. And so with 7, you might hear 7s talking about their next trip to Morocco, but it's in relation to a sense of being trapped on another level. And you might hear a 7 say, well, I don't want to get a job in a bank because then it'll be like, death in life. But there's already something in them that expects that. There's already something in them that feels trapped in a psychological closet. There's already, it's usually emotional. It's usually, you can find it somewhere in their body, in their upper chest, maybe. And it's a way in which, no matter what the outer circumstances, no matter how much they change, the 7 eventually, if they're in their trance, could make the outer circumstance into a jail, because some part of them is in jail.
Yeah.
And they expect to be that way. So sometimes getting them in touch with that is helpful. And also realizing that if you project power, you might feel powerless about that very thing. You're stuck, you're limited in a certain way, and your response is to overflex your capacity to choose. But actually, there's still some part of you that just feels trapped. And working with that, and in a direct, almost emotional way, is kind of helpful. But also understanding that with power projected, what the person is really saying, like if a 7 says, well, I don't do pain, I don't go there. What they're really saying is, I'm afraid of going there because if I go there, I feel powerless and I'll be trapped and limited and stuck. And if I start to cry, I'll cry for a month. If I agree to get together with someone, it'll turn into a horrible, dull version of my parents' marriage, that kind of thing. And what they're saying is, I don't trust myself because I know on some level that some part of me does that.
Yeah.
So teaching them how to go in and come out, go in and come out, go in and come out is really helpful. Because it builds a bridge, there's a way in which the person starts to realize, I can take a few bites of this thing, of my pain, and then I can come out and I can look around and enjoy the beauty of the day. And as a coach, I'll take that over sometimes. I'll help them go in, and then with the promise that when they come back out, I'll tell them a joke.
Brilliant.
And we do that back and forth. If you do it patiently, you start to build a bridge, and the person starts to become more confident and more in touch with their own power.
That's lovely. Last one, Tom, 8, I think.
No, forget it.
I'm not going to do it.
There's a polarity between being strong and armored and being tender and open and vulnerable and innocent. And a lot of times the paradox with NA8 is the 8 thinks that they are protecting themselves by being strong, but actually they're just sort of overpowering their weakness and denying it or making it into something else or pretending it's not there or displacing it. They can see the interaction between 2 other people, and one person seems strong and one person seems vulnerable, and the 8 will watch that closely because they represent externalized parts of the 8. So getting them, it depends on the individual, but my focus usually is on resolving that polarity and getting the person in touch with how they're protecting themselves and recognizing that they are protecting themselves by trying to bully their vulnerabilities out of consciousness.
Wow.
And the extreme of that, the crazy extreme, which also all Enneagram styles have some sort of crazy extreme, is if I can just murder my vulnerabilities, then they'll be safe.
Wow.
Also getting an 8 to recognize the impact of their behavior on other people.
Yeah.
Or, sometimes 8s will change because they see a reaction from a child, which is similar to the reaction from their own vulnerability. The reaction is, the child's afraid of them or something like that. So that's what you're working with, I think.
Yeah. Thank you, Tom. Thank you for your time and for your insight. I hope that you enjoyed learning from Tom as much as I did. My next interviewee is Ingrid Stab, who does some really great work around the Enneagram and careers and strengths. Don't forget to subscribe and do rate the podcast if you are inclined.